China isn't a military threat to Australia?
Because I've got a brain, principally, and I can think, and I can read, and I read every day, I mean, why would China want to threaten? What would be the point? They get the iron ore, the coal, the wheat. What would be the point of China wanting to occupy Sydney and Melbourne militarily? And could they ever do it? I know you're trying to ask a question, but the question is so dumb it's hardly worth an answer. Get this right, Laura. This is about the maintenance of US strategic hegemony in Asia. Now, this is a country which has no land in the metropolitan zone of Asia. There's no part of it. There's no Alaska. There's no islands. There's no US in Asia. It's 10,000 kilometres across the Pacific to the coast of California. So they are not a metropolitan Asian power, but they claim to be and wish to be the primary strategic power in Asia. They're looking around for suckers, global Britain. And they found, here's a bunch of accommodating people in Australia. At the Kabuki show in San Diego a day or so ago, there's 3 leaders standing there. Only one is paying. Our bloke, Albo.
And secondly, you have a tremendous skill for invective and criticism. Could I ask you now to turn some of that to the Chinese Communist Party and its treatment of Uyghurs, for example, its treatment of pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong? Will you be similarly critical of them as you are of people in your own party and journalists?
After what you co-wrote with Harcher last week in that shocking presentation in the Herald on Monday, Tuesday, and when you should hang your head in shame. I'm surprised you even have the gall to stand up in public and ask such a question, frankly. You ought to do the right thing and drum yourself out of Australian journalism, I mean, that's the most egregious, the worst, the most biased presentation. And here you are asking me about Uyghurs, and you're asking me about, if I said to you, and I did say when I saw it last time, here's the Prime Minister over, there's everyone over to India. Not one question from any one of you about Modi shutting in the Muslims in Kashmir, in the pro-Hindu policies. Nothing.
But there is still a question, Mr Keating, about the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs.
Yeah, well, look, the treatment of the Uyghurs, I'm not to defend China about the Uyghurs. I mean, there's disputes about what the nature of the Chinese affront to the Uyghurs are. There's a dispute about that. But one thing we can't be sure of, what if the Chinese said, but look, what about deaths in custody of Aboriginal people in your prison system? Wouldn't that be a valid point for them?
What you just saw were clips from a fiery exchange at Australia's National Press Club on March 15th, 2023. The man at the centre of it, former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating, facing a room full of the country's most powerful media journalists. It should have been a serious debate about the nation's future. At the time, the Australian government had just made a historic decision, a nuclear submarine deal with the US and the UK, tying Australia's destiny to the United States more deeply than ever before. However, the very journalists who should have been representing the Australian people, asking tough questions about this massively expensive pact, seemed to be working from a different script, one that served America's strategic agenda almost entirely. Their goal was to take down Keating, the elder statesman who dared to question the US-Australia alliance. They thought it would be an easy kill. They were dead wrong. In the content that follows, you will witness a rare public humiliation. This is not a debate. It is a masterclass in what bad journalism looks like. You will see how one veteran statesman, all by himself, systematically dismantled the bias, ignorance, and hypocrisy of an entire media elite, using nothing more than basic facts and logic. It exposed a deep crisis facing not just Australia, but many Western nations. When the media stops serving the interests of its own country, who is left to defend them? Let's continue.
The idea that we need American submarines to protect us, 3, if we buy 8, 3 are at sea, 3 are going to protect us from the might of China. Really. I mean, the rubbish of it, the rubbish. So in other words, let me say this. China has not threatened us, and despite 5 years of this China threat appearing in the Sydney Morning Herald, particularly, written by, provocateurs like Harcher and people, it's all been untrue.
So
it's untrue.
So if the threat isn't about direct invasion, as you say, there is still an issue about China finding its place in the region and being more assertive in the region. Yeah. What's the appropriate strategic response to that?
Yeah. Well, I say in the speech, but it's worth saying here. China has committed, in the eyes of the United States, the great sin of internationalism. And what is that sin? To develop an economy as big as the United States. That's the sin. They've got as big as the US. You see, and all those strategic people in the US, they get their little book out and they say, oh, state as big as us. They're licking through trying to find that, and they can't find it. They will never, the Americans will never condone or accept a state as large as them, and that's what China presents. China's mere presence. I mean, they would have preferred they remain in poverty, 20% of humanity forever. But the fact that China is now, an industrial economy larger than the United States, larger, according to the IMF, 20% larger, they say, hang on, this is not in the playbook. This is not in the playbook. What an affront. So this is what this is about. It's about the maintenance of US, get this right, Laura, this is about the maintenance of US strategic hegemony in Asia. Now, this is a country which has no land in the metropolitan zone of Asia. There's no part of it. There's no Alaska, there's no islands, there's no US in Asia. It's 10,000 kilometres across the Pacific to the coast of California. So they are not a metropolitan Asian power, but they claim to be and wish to be the primary strategic power in Asia. So what are the Chinese supposed to say to that? Oh, that's okay. We've been here 4,000 years. We've developed, we've been subjugated by every bugger known to man. We've developed a decent economy, a decent standard of living, shelter, accommodation, education, that's our sin, is it? That's our sin. And we've got to be superintended by your Navy, by the US Navy.
So you would always argue that we have to find our security in Asia.
Exactly.
And you would also argue that we have to maintain our own sovereignty in our policy.
Yeah.
If those are the rules, but you do have a China challenging the orthodoxy, if you like, of the region.
It's not, but the thing is, it's not challenging.
I'm not saying they're talking about threatening, to invade anybody, but they are a rising power and they are getting more assertive in their
Well, they're not stupid.
What
would you do if you had an economy 20% bigger than the US? Would you hide your light under a bushel?
What should we do? What do you think is the appropriate response? For example, if the Chinese want to assert themselves in terms of rights against the Philippines or Vietnam, we're not talking about an invasion or war, but in terms of asserting their rights, what is the defence and strategic?
What do you think the United States in the Western Hemisphere doesn't assert its rights against Cuba?
They're another superpower.
No, I'm just saying.
That's reasonable enough if you say that's what the US does, and you can say, well, that's what China does because it's a superpower. But what does it mean for us? What should we be doing? What it means for us is prosperity. That's what it means for us. It means that we join with 20% of humanity as they've dug themselves from poverty. So you've got to remember this about China. We're speaking of it as though it's almost like the old Soviet Union. It is not the Soviet Union. It's in the IMF. It's in the World Bank. It's in the WTO. It's in the WHO. At Davos 5 years ago, proselytising in favour of globalisation. I mean, this is not a state which wishes to overturn the West, But there's a whole lot of difference in not wishing to overturn the West and copying the nonsense from the Americans that the Chinese should live forever under their strategic command. You follow me? You've also said, though, in this speech that as a result of this announcement, in part, that the Chinese, we have set the clock ticking almost. That it has set a new trajectory for relationships in the region.
Yeah, look, China is a lonely state. That's the truth of it. They would fall over themselves having a proper relationship with us. Fall over themselves. We supply their iron ore, which keeps their really industrial base going, and there's nowhere else but us to get it. We've provided them wheat, we provide them all sorts of things, investment, what have you. They are 12 flying hours from us. We have a continent of our own, a border with no one, no border disputes with them. Perfect. No, we've manufactured a problem. You know, don't let the sleeping dogs lie. You know, we've given the old dog a kicking, you know. And so that instead of saying, you see, one of the points I've made here, and what's one of the principal problems of this deal is that defence has overtaken foreign policy. I mean, you don't see Penny Wong out there, you see Miles out there. You know, standing on the submarines is Miles, it's not Penny Wong. So what's happened is that the military have taken over the foreign policy. And as a consequence, we're not using diplomacy. I mean, let me just make this point. Running around the Pacific Islands with a lei around your neck handing out money, which is what Penny does, is not foreign policy. It's a consular task, fundamentally. Foreign policy, what you do with the great powers, what you do with China, what you do with the United States. This government, the Albanese government, does not employ foreign policy, right?
But it has improved the relationship with China since it's come to office?
Look, they've decided not to speak rudely or loudly, but at core you can see what the outcome is. Here's Anthony Albanese signing up with the Americans, the British. I mean, look, let's remember about the British. They pulled their Grand Fleet out of East Asia in 1904. They witnessed the capitulation of Singapore in 1942, right? They then announced their East of Suez policy in 1968. In other words, you're all on your own, you Australians. We're leaving. We'll leave you with Singapore and New Zealand and Malaysia, right, the FPDA. You know? And then in 1973, just to make sure we got the message, they said, well, buggy you, we're going into Europe, so no wheat, no wool, no, you know. And then, of course, after the great problem of Brexit, after that fool Johnson destroyed their place in Europe, 2 world wars. It took 2 world wars to drag Britain to the centre of Europe, to sit beside Germany as the second major power. No, you know, the empirical people, you know, the Tories, that's good enough for us. We're Great Britain. We're the great power. So, OK, they're now out of... So then they're going to put together global Britain. So they're looking around for suckers, you know, global Britain. And they found, here's a bunch of accommodating people in Australia, you know, an accommodating Prime Minister, you know, a conservative Defence Minister, a risk-averse Foreign Minister. Let's put a proposition to them. So here we are, 230 years after we left Britain, we are returning to the Cornwall where Morrison did this deal. We're returning to Cornwall, and now Rishi Sunak, for God's sake, for Australia to find our security in Asia. I mean, how deeply pathetic is that?
Well, when we last spoke in 2021, the Morrison government had just announced the AUKUS deal. You're savagely critical, as we've seen, of the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister and the Defence Minister in this deal. What does it represent in the sense of our strategic and defence position?
What does it represent?
That's been announced.
Look, I'd say for the cost, $360 billion. For $360 billion, we're going to get 8 submarines. Right? It must be the worst deal in all history. But let's say 360. If we were buying Collins-class replacements, we'd get at least 40 to 50 of those submarines. 40 to 50 for the same price. Now, no Navy's ever done better than having 1/3 of their boats at sea at any one time. So we would have, let's call it 45 to make it simple, you know, or something like that. We'd have, you know, a third of them, 15, say, at sea. 15 at sea, against 3 nuclear boats. 15 against 3. Now, remember, the nuclear boat's only firing a traditional torpedo. It's not firing a nuclear torpedo, just like the other boats. And because it's 8,000 tonnes, that's big, they're discoverable. They'll be discoverable from space. And what's more, they are too big for the shallow waters of the Australian coast. A 4,000-tonne boat like the Collins worked perfectly around the Australian coast because it was designed to protect Australia. It wasn't designed to sit off the Chinese coast sinking Chinese submarines, right? So now we've got a big 8,000-tonne clunker. We get 3 instead of 15. And you know, the Navy says, I saw with Miles, I saw Vice Admiral Collins, the head of the Navy, recently. They came up to see me. And Collins said, you know, well, Mr Keating, he said, you know, we've got to put the snort up every night to get the oxygen. I said, Admiral, please don't think I'm stupid. You only need to put the snort up if you're going at full power. If you go just cruising, you put the snort up every 4 days or so. And it may be that it is more risky now than it was 30 years ago. But if you've got 15 of the things at sea, how in the God would knocking one out matter? But if you knock one of the 3 nuclear subs out, it really matters. So now, they don't snort, but they'll be found because of their bulk. Yeah.
So in terms of the actual deal, though, you've basically said that it's been structured to support US industry by buying into the Virginia-class submarines in the short term, and that the deal is driven by the fact that the Americans don't want to disrupt or can't disrupt their manufacturing capacity, and thus there's this proposal for the British to sort of co-build the
That's right. Well, look, at the Kabuki show in San Diego a day or so ago, there's 3 leaders standing there. Only one is paying. Our bloke, Albo. The other 2, you know, they've got the band playing. Happy days are here again. You know, the American president can hardly put the 3 coherent sentences together. You know, he was happy about it all. Rishi couldn't believe, you know, Rishi, you know. And so guess what? We're going to pass across $380 billion, dollars over time to British Aircraft BAE Systems, a British company, to build these things, and to the American submarine companies, and we have to build the bases here. So, you know, at San Diego there was only one payer, the Australian Prime Minister. You know. So
where does it leave us then if we are so?
The answer is in deep doo-doo. That's where it leaves us.
Where does it go?
Where does it go? I think. I mean, what'll happen is we'll get sucked into the American control system. We'll start to. You've got to remember, it was Julia Gillard and Stephen Smith in the Obama visit who first allowed basing in Australia. I would never have allowed American basing in Australia, but they allowed it, you know. So now we're going to have Americans submarines coming and going, and of course they would say, oh, well, of course these are on rotation, they're not permanent. But if the rotation is permanent, they are permanent.
Does it make a material difference, though, that rotational presence? You know, in the way China sees it?
It just means that we are in the ambit of the US Strategic Command System. That essentially we've turned the place out. You know, in other words, we don't run the place ourselves anymore.
It essentially adds to the sense that we are our own. When we get our own Virginia-class submarines, for example, we're basically an adjunct to the Americans. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, of course. Of course. The reactor is run by the Americans. The control system is run by the Americans, and of course, Anthony Albanese is running around now. Every second sentence he talks about. What's the word?
Sovereignty?
Sovereignty? Sovereignty, yeah. He thinks if he drops the word into enough sentences in an hour, it'll actually happen. Our sovereignty is just being peeled away by all this, you know. I mean, with the Collins-class boats, we had complete sovereignty. And I'll tell you something else, which I don't think the media knows, but I know. The French government have offered the Australian government a new deal on the submarines, and that would be the new French nuclear submarine, the newest one in the world, 5% only enriched uranium, not 95% weapons grade, delivery firm date 2034, fixed prices. No response have the French had to that. So that we're going to be running around, and I mean the ignominy of having the British around. Here they are, you know, Thatcher wiped out their manufacturing sector when she knocked the unions over. They're on the bones of their bum, searching the world for, the new Britain, and here we are in Asia going back to Britain.